Right, g'day. My name's Dale, I'm from Australia. The paper is co-written by Professor Gillian Marie Vesty, who's out of ISAGA2024 University in Melbourne, Australia as well. She's been incredibly helpful. I'm nearly done on my PhD, but she's a long-time colleague and we've made a lot of games and done a lot of things together. My favourite game is my daughter's. So obviously games are connect, inform, inspire and all those wonderful things. But I play Fortnite with my daughters. It's enabled me to get to know them in ways that I never knew them before. The one on the right, not the most generous person in real life. In Fortnite, she's awesome. She'll throw potions at you, she'll throw ammo at you, she'll hang around, she'll always help everybody on her team. And the first time we played was probably when they were both about 6 years old, and Olive, my daughter on the left, said, I can't wait to go to school and tell people that we bash people with my dad. Which is cool. But we still play, which is nice. So I've got a few different roles in my life. I'm a CTO of a small business in Melbourne. We do a thing called Blue Room Mixed Reality Simulator. We do medical training for the military, police and search and rescue. So if anyone's interested in that, that's completely different to what I'm talking about today, which is my area of research. PhD candidate at RMIT University, and the topic of my PhD is accounting for values in serious game design. So this talk will just sort of narrow down on one small part of that. And I'm the Managing Director of Games for Change Asia Pacific, so I also do an annual festival in Melbourne, which is a bit similar to this in sort of scope and size and the vibe as well. So the research problem I'm looking at, and everybody knows sort of the first half of this, serious games have potential, people are using them more and more. One of the key things for me is that serious games are often compulsory, so it's even more important that they're fair and that they contain the right values than normal games. Normal games you can just go don't play it, but if you're making students play it or if you're making people do it for their health or well-being, you have to make sure that they're fair and that they're equal for all users. All games embody, beyond that, games can cause harm, and that's probably not the case with most of the games being talked about here, but particularly with the stuff I do. So we do, say, tactical combat casualty care in a simulation, which is when you're shooting back and treating a patient. We can bring up PTSD. We can create real issues for some of the people that are going through our games. We're dealing with a lot of people in our games that may be military medics but may have been through some pretty severe situations, and if we replicate them in our incredibly realistic mixed reality environment, that can cause real trauma, can cause what they call moral injury in defence. All games embody values, and if we design them, we put our values into the game. The way I always explain my PhD to people is, so if you were to design a house, how would you design it? And they're like, I'd have this and I'd have this, because I like entertaining and I like a big family, so I'd have it open. Same thing, people design their houses according to their values, and it's the same for games, whether we're doing it consciously or unconsciously. We need to account for these values, so people also laugh. My PhD is in accounting. They're like, what the hell's that got to do with games? Another way of looking at accounting is considered justified, measured and responsibly managed. That's really what accountants do. For most of us here, all our accountant does is our yearly tax return. That's the only engagement we have with accounting. But if you think of, say, a management accountant of a hospital, they're literally the ones who are making life and death decisions. They're the ones who are saying, okay, kids with cancer get this much money, old people with broken hips get this much money. So accountants have a much more interesting job than most people think. And that's something I've learned sort of over the years. And there's also a body of work in accounting that examines how we can account for what we value. And that's sort of the lens that I'm applying to the games that I'm investigating in my study. So my research questions, just really quickly: how values are accounted for, what values are at play during the serious game design development process, and what are the challenges and barriers. And I'm going to move quickly through some of these because it's less interesting than the other stuff. My research framework, really based on two books, Values at Play in Digital Games. Now, I've got to admit, when I started my PhD, I was like, ethics, and it's really hard to find much. And it's spotty and it's everywhere. And what I found was there's a huge body of work around values. And the reason for that is, I guess, because ethics is almost qualitative in terms of what people are, what's ethical to one person isn't ethical to another person, whereas values are fairly universal and you can sort of start to talk about values. So that book, Values at Play in Digital Games, is quite amazing. It doesn't talk about specific values or specific ethics. It talks about where values come out within the game design process and within the elements of a game, which are these two components. And then the lens I'm using to look at that is sort of what accountants are now using, and it's a sociological theory, and the book's called On Justification. It's by these French guys. The translation is really difficult to read, I've got to say. I thought I was bright, I'm not. After reading this book, I really struggled. Boltanski and Thevenot, and they come from 6 worlds of worth, which they look at the world through 6 worlds of worth, which I'll go into shortly. These are their 6 worlds. So there's the inspired world. Sometimes we do things just because we're inspired to, but there's no sense to it. It's just like, I just want to do it. I just want to. There's no logic. It's not for money. It's not for this. It's just, I just want to do it. The domestic world. I want to do things for my family. I want to do things because that's the way they've always been done. I want to do things because that's a traditional way of doing things. The world of fame. I want to do things because I want to stand up in front of 30 people and tell them about it and fly to New Zealand and feel like I'm awesome. Right? The civic world. I want to do things for the social good. I want to help society. I want to help the community around me. The market world. I want to make money. The industrial world. I want to do things because there's scientific rigour to this and I know it's going to work. Okay, so they're the 6 different ways that they break down people's decisions into. And it's a really useful lens to look at why people are doing things, because we're all doing all of these things all the time and at different levels. And at different times, our levels will change as well. So, for example, if I'm a game developer, if I've got a really huge game, which at the moment we've got a big contract, we're doing a huge contract for the Air Force. So we can actually afford to be a little bit more industrial about what we think and a little bit more perhaps civic and say, no, we're only going to take on that extra job because we think it's good, because we think it'll work. Whereas if we didn't have any work coming in, I just wanted to keep my developers in business, essentially, all of a sudden my values are going to change. The market's going to shoot right up, isn't it? Like, I'm going to take anything just to keep my studio alive. So it's a really interesting way of looking at why people make the decisions they make. So my research methodology is and I hate this word, this is where I feel like I'm speaking English as a second language, phenomenological study of serious games. Award finalists who have been recognised by their peers. So the reason I did that was I didn't just want to pick my friends or people who I thought were doing a good job. I deliberately picked people who had been nominated by peers for one of these awards. I've been involved in a couple of these awards, but I was always running them. I was never a judge. So that was the way of sort of distancing myself from that. And a bit of auto-ethnography from my own sort of 19 years of experience. And I've been making games for that long. Name a topic, I guarantee I've made a game about it. I almost guarantee anyway. My methods was selecting suitable candidates, familiarisation with their work, and this was an important part for me, so observing their presentations, playing their games, watching other people play their games, talking about it, because then when I went to interview them, I knew what I was talking about. And the analogy I use in my studies there's a quote, talking about music is like dancing about architecture. And it's a bit the same with games. If you're talking to someone about a game and you haven't played the game, you don't know anything. Like, it's just stupid. It's a completely different medium. They do not translate at all. You have to play the game, and then you can talk about it. I like this bit, I didn't like that bit. Okay, and then thematic analysis, which everybody's sort of done in half the other presentations as well. Pretty simple, charting things into matrices, interpreting the data. So, getting to the crux of it. One of the topics, right down here, on one of the inductive themes that came out. So the deductive themes all come out of the literature, the values of play literature, but the inductive themes just come out of those 10 interviews, the 10 90-minute interviews. And one of the interesting ones is psychological safety. What is psychological safety? This is where Google gets it semi-wrong. And a lot of people I've spoken to have gone, oh, do you know what that means? It means this. And so, not really. Google just believes the most reputable websites. So Harvard Business Review says it's this, and McKinsey says it's this, so that's what it pops up. And this is more organisational psychological safety. But the real older, more general meaning of psychological safety, which applies to everybody here, is an atmosphere where one can take chances without fear and with sufficient protection. Thus, a climate is built which encourages provisional tries and which tolerates failure without retaliation, renunciation or guilt. And I think that's what most of us here want when we have people play our game. We want them just to go for it and to feel free to do whatever they need to do without sort of being afraid of the outcomes. Why psychological safety for me? The top right picture is my grandfather, and he was an engineer, And in World War II, he went off to and built airfields in Papua New Guinea. Now, before he left for that war, he was a footballer with Carlton Football Club in Australia, a real sort of go-getter. When he came back, he was incredibly damaged by what he saw. He never recovered. Back then, he just said, I have bad nerves. And they used to call it things like nervous breakdown or my nerves are shot and all these sorts of terms. But now what they call that is moral injury. Like, he came back and it destroyed the rest of his life, really. Just as a young man, I think he was back when he was 25. Now, somewhat ironically, this is one of our projects we're doing at the moment. We've just built a virtual Papua New Guinea airfield for training. So full circle. He was digging it out by hand. We built this in about a week, I think. But life's funny. But the training that we're doing in this virtual environment still has the potential to cause damage to a lot of the people that we're taking into it. So in our mixed reality training scenario, you're going in there, you're getting attacked by an enemy who's sort of invading the airfield, you have to shoot back, and then you have to treat a patient that's been shot next to you. And that's the thing. So there's just a lot to consider when we're making these sort of virtual scenarios. Like, we're not, I'm not saying it's as bad as war, I'm definitely not, but the same dangers exist, and we don't want to cause that moral injury at all. And a lot of the people I'm working with at the Air Force, like, some of them are, they've been through some horrible stuff. They're the ones who pick people up from the Bali bombings. They're the ones who have been over in Afghanistan picking up the wounded. They've got some horrible stories to tell. So it's easy to trigger that stuff. Now, the conflict comes in where, especially for the training we do, I do a lot of firefighting stuff as well, a lot of first responder stuff. We actually want people to be pretty stressed when they're training. Like, we don't just want it to be easy, so we can't wipe out all psychological danger. We want there to be a certain amount of psychological danger, or a certain amount of psychological stress to what we're doing, because people have to train at the level they're going to operate at. And there's no use in, firefighters reading about something in a book and then you throw them into a fire and expect them to behave accordingly. You sort of have to start to replicate the situation somewhat, and that's what simulation is all about, isn't it? Thank you. So that's the stress there that we're dealing with, and that's the Yerkes-Dodson curve, which I don't know, many of you are probably familiar with, but we deal with all the time. So all the interviews I did, as you can see, there's a lot of different sort of areas covered: learner driver training, space, social work, disability care. And then this was one of the frameworks that I come across, which was by Peters, and all the references down there. And this basically just goes through all the places that you really need to look at psychological safety when you're creating a game. And what I decided to do was just map his framework against what we'd found out through our interviews. And we found that it sort of aligned quite closely. So there's intake, scenario, roles. I'm not going to go into the detail of each one. The materials, the steps of play, assessing the performance of flexibility. But he actually goes into these are the things that you should be looking at and general considerations. And then what I was able to do was align some of the quotes we got from those interviews with some of the things that Peters et al. Said that we should be looking for. So it's difficult to be able to gamify things when your brother, well, how would you feel if your brother and sister was a year younger than you and performed better than you? It's difficult. So that was something that came up with a game that was designed for young kids to recognise ADHD. And it was a tablet-based thing. And the idea firstly was that they'd do it from home, but then they realised this is a real issue because the kids are going to play it and then their siblings are going to play it and then those kids are going to feel dumb. They're not going to feel like it's actually going to do damage to them. So that changed the setting of their game. Then they made it, no, it has to be a clinical thing. You have to actually come in and play it in the clinic, and that's the only time you get to see the game. Another person who does workshops, I don't assume everybody's got a positive response to the idea of play. I was talking about this before to somebody. I know people have very complex relationships to certain experiences. This is a guy who runs play workshops in Melbourne and had a lady who basically said her parents never let her play as a kid. And whenever she was told to play, she felt guilty, like she felt this deep sense of guilt and dread just about being asked to play. The scenario. So this was about the driver training. So this was really about reducing the amount of distraction and reducing the amount of anxiety within the learner driver training scenario so that people weren't freaking out while they were having their first experiences behind the wheel and really slowly levelling them up. Because this was a developer who'd been a learner driver with his brother who'd screamed at him the whole time. And some of us probably had that experience as well, I'm guessing. Another one from the guy who does the workshops, thinking about food creates a sense of safety. So this was one of the first things he did as an icebreaker, was just something that was very kind of personal, but also not very easy to share. So rather than asking people to, dance like an octopus or the things that we were doing, which, as I said, was good in this context, he goes in knowing not everyone's going to be comfortable in this group. He's going into a corporate environment. First thing he asks people to do is share what's your favourite food. That's just a really, really easy, gentle icebreaker that everybody eats, The materials. So this was another one for a guy who was making games for people with intellectual disabilities, and their big issue was all the games they were given to play were childlike, and they weren't children. They were 30, 40-year-olds with acquired brain injury or whatever. They didn't want that stuff. They didn't want the childlike stuff. And every time you gave them that stuff, it just reminded them and really made them feel bad and damaged them, really. Gave them that sense of moral injury that, I'm not as smart. I'm as smart as a kid. That's why they're giving me kids' games, rather than something that was for their level. Flexibility, same thing for the games thing, for the learner driving. You couldn't go too far off, you couldn't crash, you couldn't sort of get into dangerous situations. As soon as you went over a barrier, the kit just faded to black. It was very, very simple. Oh. And another guy who was making games for people with intellectual disabilities was just slowing it down and making it so you could really slowly level up, because he didn't want anybody going in and feeling like, this is a game for me and I'm still too slow, I'm still too dumb. So he really had to make it start at a really, really low level. And then if you were good at it, it would speed up really quickly. But that was another consideration, to not cause damage to those people. Findings. So the checklist was pretty good. When I linked everything against it, it's actually a really good thing that developers could go through and could use, potentially. Second thing was that the serious game developers and simulation developers are actually considering psychological safety. Everybody I spoke to was very sensitive to this sort of stuff. And I had a conversation earlier. I think people who are doing these sorts of games are probably different than normal game developers in that they're trying to improve society. They're very aware of the dangers associated with what we're doing. There was a big topic of user and player-centered design, which I know was the topic of the last talk. Can and does work, but definitely has some limitations. It's much easier when you have a smaller audience or a smaller topic, but it's very difficult when we had one of our game designers was doing things for young, disenfranchised people in the community, and it's how do you cover all those disenfranchised people? Okay, my time's up. Financial resources are a really big thing. That's definitely a future topic. Multiple stakeholder groups have a really big influence on the values in a game, and limited resources kill evaluation, as everybody in this room knows. Yeah. Ultimately, the playful is political, and it's up for the lead game developer to make these judgments and to balance everything and to be aware of things. But I guess as academics, and putting my academic hat on for a minute, it's our job to give them that information and to give them the resources, give them frameworks to use. And next steps there. A bit more, I've got a lot more interpretation to do of the data I've collected and coming up with some practical resources for designers. So I guess that comes into the coming up with ethical standards and things like that, actually giving people some things to go by. And that's it from me.
Thanks. Some questions for that. There's a lot there to take in.
A lot of this stuff caters towards the lowest common denominator because you're very sensitive to all that stuff. Well, what about the other end of it? Because you don't want to lose people as well, right? So there's a sweet spot, I'm sure, there somewhere.
Yeah, I think a lot of quotes did, to be honest. I'd say like with the aeromedical stuff, it's the opposite. They're like very high performers. They're usually doctors who are in the Air Force, so they're crazy high performers. But it's also just recognising that there's still a lot of dangers for that group and being a little bit sensitive about it. It's hard though, because yeah, you're right. Like it could be that one person in 100 that you're actually hurting, but that's still a lot. You can feel that one person. I think the analogy for me is it's a bit like PE class. You know, I'm sure everybody in this room remembers the one kid in PE who just got bullied and had a horrible, horrible time, and the sports teacher just completely ignored him or her because they weren't good at sport. I think it's about allowing for that one person somehow, and thinking about it rather than just going, no, this is sport, and if you're not good at it, bad luck type thing. Which,
Okay, thanks.
And you said that player-centered design has some limitations, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm just wondering what other approaches would work better in design experience.
I think that's when it comes back to the design of recognising does compromise, because there's always limited resources. It's a bit like the hospital management thing I said to you before. You're never going to be able to please everybody. All you can do is say, these are my values, this is what I want to embody in the game, and this is how it's going to be, and accept those trade-offs in a sense. We have some real issues in Melbourne, like RMIT. If we're designing for students at RMIT, good luck. They're from every country all around the world. You know, it's not like you can get, and one of the quotes was, it's not like we can just get one Indian and go, yeah, Indians are represented. There's 2 billion Indians. Like, one Indian does not represent 2 billion Indians. You know, it's crazy. So it is, a lot of it's about, yeah, do that, but also recognise that these are the values I want the game to have, and I'm responsible for those values, and that they can't kind of be palmed off onto a focus group, if that makes sense. It's, perhaps a messy answer. Yeah.
Two questions. One question is, when you had this psychological safety definition from Google, and then one very old one from the 60s, if you, how much the work of Amy Edmondson plays a role in your research?
Yeah.
That is one question. The second question is, from your research, do you have anything that tells about the debriefing and the role of the debriefing to create psychological safety?
Sure. So Amy Edmondson, the first one, she's the one who coined the phrase organisational psychological safety. So that's the one that Google gives you. Yeah. I don't know whether to blame. I think it's mainly technology that's kind of to blame for then that spinning out into the meaning for psychological safety. Okay. My perception of that is that it's more driven by that's where the money is. I think she's at Harvard Business School, isn't she? There's obviously a big interest in looking after worker welfare and these sorts of things, whereas yes. I guess what we're looking at is a little bit broader than that. So, and obviously, yeah, I think what she's doing is just one subsection of psychological safety as a whole. So, yeah, definitely a strong influence, but also I think the strength of her reputation and that reputation has led to everybody thinking that's what psychological safety is now. Because I had told one person and they're like, oh, that means this. And I'm like, no. In one context only, yeah, if that makes sense. The other question in terms of debriefing, it wasn't a huge thing in a lot of the people I interviewed, I have to say. In what I do personally, it's a very big thing, especially the military and the defence type stuff. It's a very big thing. We build debriefing into what we do very carefully. And it's handled very sensitively. But I've got to say, it's not really included in this paper that much, just because a lot of these were very much standalone games and simulations that didn't have the traditional briefing go into do the scenario and debriefing.
Yeah, maybe it's not necessary to have a traditional briefing, but it is necessary to have a debriefing. Otherwise, why then it's a serious game?
Like the learner game, it's kind of built into the game. So you're just playing a game, you're going through levels.
Yeah.
There's no real debriefing after it. It's instant feedback. You go off the road, you fail. You get back on the road, you go. Yeah, it's all very... The feedback's instant. It's not like you go through and you're allowed to run off the rails or anything and then come back at the end.
It's highly problematic.
Well,
it has nothing to do with creating psychological safety.
What, with having no debriefing?
With no debriefing, yes. I doubt.
Yeah. I think it depends on the nature of the game. I think if your feedback's instant, then it's different than letting people run through a scenario and then giving feedback at the end.
Sounds like a topic for a much longer conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you. Right, no more questions? Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
And now we have